I still remember my first time going to youth group as a kid. I was in 6th grade, and my family didn't really go to church a ton, so I didn't know a lot of the kids there. And I remembered how uncomfortable I was from the minute I walked in the door. We played games where it seemed like all the other students knew the rules, except for me. We talked about Bible stories and verses that seemed like common knowledge to everyone, except for me. And everyone else already had lots of friends. It seemed like everybody already knew everybody, except for me. And while I know that this youth group didn't mean to give off this exclusive vibe, the message I got was loud and clear. You don't belong here. And in my 6th grade mind, if I didn't belong in a youth group, then I didn't belong in the church. And if I didn't belong in the church, then I didn't belong with God. Maybe you've had an experience similar to mine, where you just didn't feel at home in a church or a Christian community. And maybe you've told yourself the same false story that I did, that if I feel out of place with Christians, then I have no place with God. This is an experience and belief that many people hold, and one that the church, unfortunately, often perpetuates, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that some people are in and other people are out. But today, I want to talk about an aspect of God's kingdom that might just speak to those of you who are feeling left out. If you've been following this King Mode series, you know that last week we talked about how the kingdom of God, the rule and reign and presence of God, is near to us. And we discover this through Jesus' first teaching in the Gospel of Matthew. But today, we're moving on to another one of Jesus' teachings. DJ Khaled! Another one. In Matthew chapters 5 through 7, Jesus gives his famous Sermon on the Mount. Now, chances are, if you've spent some time in and around church, that you've heard some of the famous teachings from this sermon. You are the light of the world. Love your enemies. Take the log out of your own eye. But one thing that we don't normally do is look at the Sermon on the Mount as a whole. And if we do, we'll notice that this entire teaching from Jesus has a theme. In almost every passage and saying, Jesus is describing what life looks like in the kingdom of heaven. It's time for a Bible nerd tip. When you read the Sermon on the Mount, read it as a description of life in the kingdom. And Jesus starts this whole description by giving a list of who is blessed in the kingdom. And the first group that appears on this list might just surprise you. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, this verse has perhaps become familiar to some of us, but we need to take a second and recognize just how backwards and surprising this is. Remember, we just talked about how so many of us have had experiences where we feel that if we can't fit in with religion, then certainly we can't fit in with God. And that was just as true, if not more true, for the people living in Jesus' day. And yet, these are the type of people Jesus is describing when he says, poor in spirit. I love the way that Dallas Willard paraphrases this listing, who he calls the hopeless blessables. He says, blessed are the spiritual zeros, the spiritually bankrupt, deprived, and deficient, the spiritual beggars, those without a wisp of religion, when the kingdom of heaven comes upon them. Have you ever felt like a spiritual zero? Like your faith wasn't good enough? Like you weren't good enough to show up to church or to call yourself a Christian? If that's where you are today, then I want you to be encouraged, because according to Jesus, you too have access to the kingdom. You too have access to God through him. What Jesus is saying here is that the kingdom of God is not just for the best and the brightest, the most holy or the most faithful. It's not just for those who read their Bible every day or show up to church every week or who have a consistent quiet time. But Jesus came for everybody, to open up God's kingdom to anybody, even the nobodies. The good news of Jesus is that God's kingdom has been opened up and come near to you, even if you feel like a spiritual zero. Even if you feel like you don't belong in church, even if you feel judged by Christians, the reality is the exclusive nature of people cannot overcome the inclusive love of God. Even if you feel like you have never had a place in religion, you have a home in the heart of God. And maybe this is just the encouragement that you needed to hear today. Or maybe this is the encouragement that someone in your life needs to hear. Maybe you know someone who sees themselves in that category of hopeless blessables. And maybe today, God actually wants to use you to encourage them that the kingdom of God is open and available to them as well. Take some time today and figure out who those people in your life might be. And if you need some help with that, as always, we have a next step practice available for download in the description. As for now, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Please give me a follow on Instagram at John Jorgensen for more encouraging content there. Until then, I will see you all next week as we continue our King Mode series. I love you all. Keep being awesome.